So as indicated at the end of the previous video, in this video we're going to consider how government policies such as taxes, subsidies, price floors, and price ceilings impact prices and quantities in perfectly competitive markets. So I didn't add that emphasis at the end of the previous video, but it's really important that we keep that in mind now. So these implications about whether or not a government intervention would be desired or would be beneficial are really only applicable when we have those four primary assumptions of perfect competition being met. Next week, we're going to consider imperfectly competitive markets and deviations from perfect competition. We're going to see that the recommendations for government interventions are going to change dramatically. However, before we do that, it's going to be helpful to think about what the baseline case is for understanding how government policies interact in perfectly competitive markets. And when I say baseline, I mean the simplest way of understanding it, not necessarily the most realistic. That, in fact, we may think that most markets that we interact with on a daily basis are not perfectly competitive. However, this is the starting point because it is the simplest model to understand. So even though perfectly competitive markets aren't ubiquitous, they're not everywhere, they do still exist. And so this video is important because it will help you understand how a government policy may impact your industry or company if you do work in a perfectly competitive industry. It may help you understand what unintended impacts your preferred policy may have if you are implementing a policy in a perfectly competitive industry. And importantly here, this video should help you be able to predict changes in prices and quantities which are associated with different government interventions, which will be required of you in this class. So when we think about the impact of taxes on demand, we want to keep in mind those other letters for what demand represents, that it's not just D, it also refers to marginal benefit and to willingness to pay. And so because the demand curve captures willingness to pay, when we add a tax into the market, that is going to decrease our willingness to pay for the good, because now we have to not only pay for the good, we have to pay a tax as well. And so let's draw that on this graph. Let's say that there is a per unit tax. It's about as flat as I can draw. We'll label the tax T. And so now consumers don't only have to pay the market price, they have to pay that tax T. So what this is going to result in is a decrease in the demand curve by that amount T. And so our demand curve now is going to be D1. So if we would add the value of T to the value of D1 for the entire curve, I apologize. That dog is going to be coming into these videos from time to time and making a clatter. But if we add that value of T to the value of D1 for the entire demand curve, then we would get the original demand curve, which would capture the preferences and wants and tastes of the buying population. So a tax on demand or tax on consumers is always going to decrease the demand curve at every single price. So we can conduct the same sort of analysis when thinking of how a tax on producers would impact supply. So let's draw that same low per unit tax T. And do you think this is going to increase or decrease supply? So if we think about our initial understanding of the factors which shift supply and think about anything that increases the cost of production is going to lead to a leftward shift in supply, then obviously a tax on production is going to make it more costly to produce. And so when we have a tax that's levied on suppliers, that is going to shift the supply curve to the left by the amount T. And so we have S naught plus T, it's kind of like a 6. We want that to be a little smaller. S naught plus T is going to equal S1. And so it's going to be a leftward shift in the supply curve, which is going to represent that the marginal cost of production is now going to be greater for every unit which is produced. Now, when we think of how decreases in supply, decreases in demand impact consumer and producer surplus, we can unambiguously state that they are going to decrease welfare. They're going to make both consumers and producers worse off in total. And so if we have a decrease in the supply curve, then the price at which the unit is bought or sold increases, which would otherwise increase producer surplus. However, we are losing this whole rectangle here, which is no longer a part of producer surplus. So even though they gain this little rectangle, they lose that bigger one. Similarly, that will unambiguously harm consumers, because whereas they initially had consumer surplus of the red triangle, they now have consumer surplus of the green triangle. And we could learn similar lessons from analyzing a decrease in demand, which is attributable to a tax levied on consumers. To see that, we notice that a decrease in demand to D1 is going to decrease price. And now the producer surplus goes from being this orange triangle to being this purple triangle. So that unambiguously harms producers. And the story with consumers is once again a little more complicated, because a lower price should benefit consumers. However, they're losing out on this triangle, and now they're gaining this triangle. So once again, it kind of depends on the relative size of those different, those aren't triangles, those are trapezoids. It depends on the relative size of those different trapezoids. So it's always going to hurt the other party in terms of the consumer and producer surplus. But here we're also not thinking about the actual value of the tax revenue which is collected. And first of all, where that tax revenue goes. Second of all, who is paying more of the tax revenue. To fully understand that part of the equation, we're going to have to wait until next week. So I won't spend a ton of time going through the process of how subsidies work for producers and consumers, but a subsidy is just a reverse tax. It is paying somebody to buy something, or paying somebody to produce something, or giving them a little bit of an extra incentive to engage in that consumption or production. So a common example of a subsidy for consumers is solar panels. So since if we're trying to encourage a certain type of behavior and we want more people to decrease their carbon footprint by installing solar panels, but solar panels are expensive, then the government can offer a subsidy, can make it cheaper for people to buy solar panels. And this is going to increase demand for solar panels by increasing the marginal benefit. So that's what a subsidy levied on consumption would do. And we would think that a subsidy levied on production would do the same thing, would increase the supply of that good or service. So a common example of a subsidy on production is in agriculture, that we have agricultural subsidies which lower the marginal cost. So the government says, we will pay you a certain amount to produce this good, whether or not it's bought or sold. So that's going to lower the marginal cost of production, which is going to increase the supply curve of that good. So similar to taxes, though working in the opposite direction, a subsidy on production is going to lower the market price and increase the market quantity, which is going to be unambiguously good for consumers who were originally facing that consumer surplus and now get this initial block. Similarly, subsidizing consumption by increasing the demand curve is going to increase the market price of that good, which is going to increase the producer surplus unambiguously, which was originally this little triangle, and now goes all the way up here. Now, another common type of market intervention is that of a price floor. Now, the most commonly used example for a price floor is a minimum wage. So in this example, I'm going to illustrate a minimum wage in a perfectly competitive market. So when we have an effective price floor, so it should be noted that these are effective or binding, then we have a price which is set above the equilibrium price. We'll call this PF for P floor. And what it does is it prevents the price from dropping below that barrier. You can think of this as kind of like a net, and it doesn't allow price to decrease below that point. So when we think back to our first couple of videos on supply and demand, we will recognize that this leads to a glut, where the quantity demanded is going to be less than the quantity supplied. And so when that is the case, we know that our new price is going to be the price floor. We know that we're not going to be in equilibrium, that our quantity demanded is going to be less than our quantity supplied, and we're going to have people who are willing to work, who are supplying their labor at that wage, who are unable to find a job at that wage because the amount of their work which is demanded is going to be less than the amount of their work which is supplied. And so what does this then imply about consumer and producer welfare? So when we think about consumer and producer surplus, we know that we calculate the difference between the market price and the demand curve or the supply curve. So for the amount of units which are bought and sold. So how many units are bought and sold when we have two different market quantities? Well, because we have a surplus or a glut, it means that these units aren't being bought and sold. Those are accumulating on store shelves. This is our market quantity. And so it means that our consumer and producer surplus, our consumer surplus, is going to be the area under the demand curve and above the market price, which is PF. And so it's going to be just this little triangle when it used to have been this big triangle without the price floor. So a binding or effective price floor will reduce consumer welfare in a perfectly competitive market. It's possible that it'll do the same thing for producers as well, since producers now they would be obtaining this new price. However, they're missing out on all of the units between QD and Q naught, and so their producer surplus looks like that. And so we're missing out on this big red triangle here. This is going to be what we call deadweight loss, which will abbreviate DWL. Now I should highlight or remind you that these consequences of price floors and price ceilings only apply in a perfectly competitive market and are only applying when the price ceiling or price floor is binding, when it's set beyond what the equilibrium price would have been. So a common example of price ceilings are that of rent control, that if the equilibrium rent for a one-bedroom apartment in the Upper East Side is $3,000, and that would set the quantity demanded equal to the quantity supplied, then we could think of an effective price ceiling as being $2,000, that the local government steps in and says, you cannot buy or sell an apartment unit for more than $2,000 a month, even though $3,000 a month for a one-bedroom apartment may be the equilibrium rent. So a effective or binding price ceiling, say PC, will be set below the equilibrium price, and this will wind up in a situation where the quantity demanded is going to be greater than the quantity supplied. So that is a shortage. So when we try to engage in rent control in a perfectly competitive rental market, we may be shutting people out of being able to purchase a home or an apartment which they would otherwise buy. To see this by looking at consumer and producer welfare, we can see that under the initial equilibrium conditions, producer surplus was that blue triangle, and under the rent control, producer surplus is now that little blue triangle. So they're obviously worse off. What about consumers? What about the renters? Well, under the initial market conditions, their consumer surplus was that green triangle, and now we'll use red. Their consumer surplus is going to be the area underneath the demand curve, so same demand curve. Above the price, we have a lower price, but only for the amount of units which are bought and sold, and so it's this parallelogram. So while they get this whole area here, they're made better off by this, they lose this area over here. And so whether they're made better off or worse off depends on the size of those two shapes. However, we can unambiguously say that as a society, we're made worse off because this value is gone. Nobody is getting this anymore, not the producers, not the consumers, not the renters, not the landlords. And so when we have effective or binding price ceilings, we're going to reduce our total economic welfare in a perfectly competitive market. I'm going to keep repeating myself on that point. So just as effective and binding price ceilings and price floors are bad for consumers and producers in a perfectly competitive economy, quotas are also going to be inefficient or suboptimal. And a quota is just going to be a restriction on quantity. So either indicating that the quantity should be less than the equilibrium quantity, or the quantity should be more than the equilibrium quantity, or in the off chance that the prediction is absolutely spot on, it may stipulate that the market quantity should be the equilibrium. So to show why this is inefficient, obviously a effective price floor leads to a surplus, an effective price ceiling leads to a shortage. To show why a quota is inefficient, let's again think of the letters which we associate with demand and supply. So we think of demand as representing marginal benefit and supply representing marginal cost. So if we have a quota over here, we'll call this quota high, then this means that we are producing and consuming QH units. So we are getting this full benefit where marginal benefit is greater than marginal cost. Remember, this is marginal benefit up here, and this is marginal cost down here. However, for every unit beyond Q naught and before QH, we are operating at a place where marginal cost is greater than the marginal benefit. So this whole area is a loss to consumers, and you can basically subtract this out of our initial consumer welfare. So we are made worse off by having too high of a quota. Now it's a little less obvious to see why having too low of a quota would be bad, because we still have a case where marginal benefit is greater than marginal cost. However, if we were to calculate what our consumer and producer surplus would be, then we would note that we are leaving out this whole triangle again. So we once again have our deadweight loss. We are leaving opportunities on the table. These are unexploited gains from trade, where if we would increase our production and consumption a little bit more, there are some people who would obtain a higher benefit than a cost for those units of consumption and production. So quotas which are set not in accordance with equilibrium forces or equilibrium supply and demand conditions in a perfectly competitive market are going to be inefficient as well.